down the list of people that have come into the webinar, and I know some of you, so absolutely lovely to see you here. And some of you I'm getting to meet, which is great. So a little bit about Mineral Check, and what we're going to cover today. I spoke to Sam and she asked me to cover an introduction to hair mineral testing, how to register as a practitioner, how to take a sample, and a little bit about the results. So that's what we're going to do over the next hour. I am going to record the webinar, and you will get a copy of the webinar if you would like to listen to it at a later date. And for the people who couldn't actually make it. So I thought that would be helpful. So a little about Mineral Check. We represent the American laboratory, Tracer Elements. We have been in the UK now for 18 years this year, and that's why I put we've come of age. Trace Elements have been going for about 40 years in America. They are a properly licensed and registered laboratory. They are inspected regularly by the FDA, and they specialize in hair mineral testing. So why would we test the hair? The hair test is a very safe and a non-invasive test. It measures the levels of nutrient minerals and also toxic minerals. And we also report the ratios, so we'll compare one to another. And I'll look through that as we go through the webinar and we start to look at some proper results. The hair testing is going to give us, as well as the exact levels of each mineral found, an overview of someone's health, someone's adrenal status, their mineral balance, their hormones, and their digestion. It is not a diagnostic test of anything, it is just a screening test. But the screening test provides us with lots of information that we can use in clinic. There are other methods of testing for the minerals. And the first one that I wanted to cover very briefly is urine testing. There are a couple of labs that do this, but urine testing is quite awkward for your clients because it requires you to take the urine over a 24-hour period. So the whole urine has to be collected, it has to be put into a jug, and then you extract the sample that's needed. So collecting urine over a 24-hour period is awkward for the client, but also for you as a practitioner. It will only give you an idea of that was excreted during the day. The other option is blood testing, and blood testing is useful for some nutrients. For example, the B vitamins. You cannot test a vitamin in the hair, but you can test just the minerals. Once you have the mineral level, you can have an idea about which vitamins might be needed because of the relationship between the two. And we will look at that in a little bit more detail later. But blood testing is really useful if you want to know a vitamin specifically, particularly something like functional B vitamins. The only way to really know whether or not the B vitamins are being taken in and utilized properly by the body, and the levels will be to test the blood. But blood testing for minerals is not that efficient. If we take something like calcium and we test calcium in the blood, it will give us the level, but the body has a homeostatic balance for calcium and it will keep that whatever. So you could measure the blood calcium levels of, say, a 12-year-old girl, and then you could measure the same person in her 70s when she's osteoporotic, and you would still get exactly the same reading for calcium. The blood has that homeostatic range and it will hold it within that regardless. When we look at tissue testing, we have something different. The blood homeostatic range is controlled, and so the body will, a little bit anthropomorphic here, but bear with me, the body will move the mineral level out of the blood and into the tissues. So if we take that 12-year-old and we test her, we can see how she's utilizing her calcium correctly or not. We can maybe test her again when she's 30 and check that her calcium is being properly utilised. If we measure her at 70 and we know she's osteoporotic, we might see very, very high calcium in the tissues. So we know that calcium is biounavailable, which means the body isn't actually utilising it. So the tissues let us see a lot more of what's going on. The other thing is that blood is a snapshot. It gives you just that moment. With hair mineral analysis, you're looking at the last 3 months as a rough guideline if you take the sample as we suggest. So you're getting a picture of the minerals over a 3-month period. And I put this little study in. It's quite an old one. It was done in 1972, but I think it's absolutely fascinating because it bears out what I've been talking about. Cows were given 300 parts per million of cadmium in their drinking water. That's quite a low level. And over a 12-week period, they would have had 4.5 milligrams. And their blood was measured throughout the 12 weeks. And the cadmium showed up very briefly at the end, but not during the 12 weeks because very little was going in. And the amounts that showed in the blood were very, very negligible. But within the liver and kidneys and also the hair, so the animals were biopsied, the levels were found within 4 weeks. So what we see is very little cadmium in the blood, but quite high levels appearing after 4 weeks of a consistent exposure. So the blood was the cadmium was coming in, it was being ingested, it was going into the bloodstream, and it was being moved out and put into storage. For the last 4 to 12 weeks, very little cadmium showing in the blood, but consistently high levels in the liver, the kidneys, and the hair. As practitioners, we cannot take biopsies of the liver or the kidneys, but we can easily get a sample of hair. So we can use that as not diagnostic of what's happening in the body, but representative of. And what I really like about this study is it shows that we are quite correct in using the hair tissue as an example of what's happening further on in the body. So it's really a screening tool. And I put a little note here about keeping it real, because one of the things that you find if you do an internet search is there are a lot of people that say a lot of sites offering to diagnose food intolerances or parasites from a hair sample. And I put this little note up because that's really not possible. That's done on an a kind of a dowsing machine. And you cannot test for food intolerances or parasites from the hair. What you can get is you might get clues. And so sometimes you'll get back a report which may say that there is the potential for a gut bacterial issue, perhaps because there is a very high copper level. So we would know there might be something going on in the gut. We might suggest that some foods are best avoided because of their mineral pattern, but we cannot diagnose food intolerances or parasites from a hair sample. And I put that there because I do at work occasionally get emails from practitioners saying that they've had a client come in with a test and it says, and what do I think? And I will say, absolutely rubbish. It just doesn't work. Mineral levels, yes, keep it real. I put a little note here because the one thing that you can do is you can look at anorexia because the sulfur levels will go very high. You can look at, and it's used by some laboratories in the States to look at drugs and drink problems. Really interesting in Arizona. If you have a drink driving offence, you're offered the option of losing your license and being fined, or agreeing to abstain from alcohol completely. And the way they measure your abstinence is through the hair. So it's a test which has a lot of implications, some of which are well beyond the scope of nutritional therapy, but is very well recognised, particularly in the States, and actually becoming more so here. At Mineral Check, we test for a hospital in Wales. And I love that one because we were actually found to be cheaper than the NHS laboratory, so the Welsh hospital outsources it to us. And it's used by a paediatric consultant. I was looking for the right word there, a paediatric consultant. So I think that's quite fascinating how some of what we do is slowly becoming quite mainstream. If you would like to use Mineral Check and you're not already, and I know some people in the seminar are familiar with us, but if you would like to register with Mineral Check as a practitioner, you simply go to our website, which is mineralcheck.com, and you fill in the little form that's on the practitioner page with your details, hit the send button. That will come over to us in the office, and we will then register you as a practitioner. Functional bits. The turnaround time is averagely about 6 days usually, unless the lab is very, very busy, in which case it might creep to 10. So I normally say 7 to 10 days turnaround. And the cost of the test, if you just want the graph, it's 33 to you as a practitioner. And if you want the interpretive report, it is 39 with a retail of 69, and then retest slightly cheaper. And what we will to move on now in the webinar is that's the kind of the functional introduction to me out of the way, and a little bit briefly about how you can access our samples. We are going to look at how to take a sample, and then we'll move on to looking at the results. If you have any questions, I'm going to leave time at the end for questions. You should be able to pop a little question in the chat box down here. And hit the send box, and it'll come up on the screen. And so if you do have a question as I'm going along, feel free just to chip in and I will answer it. I know Julie said she'd just got a static face, but I hope you've got back the video. If you haven't, give us a call and I'll get my colleague Nick to give you a hand. I'm just the static face is because I can't actually load the camera. I will be clear about that one, but hopefully you can see the presentations that's going on, Julie. So how do we take a hair sample and how do the minerals get into the hair? And this is a little graphic of a hair sample, and it shows the hair growing out through the scalp. What happens? Hang on, I'm just going to answer Julie's question. Yeah, Julie, that's absolutely fine. There isn't a video, it's just the presentation on the screen, which you should be able to see. If not, I think my colleague might simply be the camera as an issue, and I will give you a number to buzz. If that doesn't work, give my colleague Nick a call. Hang on a second, I'm going to give his number and I'll have to edit it out. It's 07946 383 014, and he'll probably be able to work it out for you. So that was 07946 383 014. So the hair sample is growing in the scalp, and as it is growing beneath the scalp, it's bathed by the intracellular tissues. Now, remember I said the body will take certain elements out of the blood. It moves it out of the blood and into intracellular tissue. And so as that is transported around the body by, for example, the lymph nodes, it's actually coating the shaft of the hair sample. And as the sample grows out, it hardens and it retains that mineral pattern. As it retains the mineral pattern, it means that it is a very stable sample. You can cut the hair today, you can then test it in a week's time, a month's time, 10 years' time. The pattern will not deteriorate. You will still see exactly the same thing. So we take the sample from the scalp. It is possible to use other body tissues, but we would recommend you take it from the scalp. You want the sample about 4 centimeters long. You want to use clean scissors, fairly obvious. I often take my own sample here in the office, just with the office scissors, which makes my colleagues laugh because when they do theirs, they're a little bit more precise and they faff about, and one of them actually goes to a hairdresser and does it, and they insist on using properly hair scissors. But really, so long as your scissors are clean, you take it from the back of the scalp or underneath, and the only reason for that is you just want to avoid any maybe external contaminants that may be resting on the head, and you pop it in the envelope. It's quite simple. If the hair is longer than 4 centimeters, cut off the distal end and discard that. It is possible to use nails, it is possible to use pubic hair. If you use those, they are good for toxic elements, but I am always very cautious about using them for nutrient minerals because the pubic hair and body hair, like underarm hair, has a very different growth physiology. It grows to a certain length, hangs around, and then drops out. So you don't know how old the pattern actually is. That's why we say don't actually use those. Here is a hair sample waiting to go off to the lab. You can see we have the little weight scales that help you measure the correct weight. If you don't have those, it's about a teaspoonful of hair. External influences, yeah, dyes, highlights, we get asked a lot about that. And in principle, they don't really affect the results. I'm a practitioner. If my client has dyed hair or highlighted hair, I always test it. Shampoos are not on the hair for long enough to affect the results. So I wouldn't worry about those unless, and a very big caveat there is, unless they are using an anti-dandruff shampoo. That can give you an elevated zinc level. So if someone is using an anti-dandruff shampoo, I will always say switch to a baby shampoo before testing for about 2 weeks. And I put this little chart in. I know it's not totally easy to read, but what you can see over here is an incredibly high lead level. And that lead level, I put it in because it's so very obvious. The lead level is elevated because this client was using a shampoo, sorry, not a shampoo, yes, a shampoo. It's a hair treatment. He specifically was using Grecian 2000 for men. And some products that blacken the hair have lead in them. And what we see here is this really elevated lead. And I put that in just so that you can see how very, very obvious and contamination looks. So I want to cover what the test results look like, which for some of you will be very familiar, how to use the results and how you can get the best from them. So here we have, and if you go full screen, you have the sample of the results. You can see we have the nutritional minerals here, you have the toxic minerals here, and then we have the additional minerals here. Now, with this person, Susie, we can see that she has very low levels of most of the nutritional minerals. She has quite elevated toxic minerals, and there's a couple of little quirky things going on down in the additional minerals. So when I look at the results, the first thing I would look at is the ratios, which is on the second page. And from the ratios, I can learn quite a lot, as well as actually just looking at the toxic elements. So the first thing we see with this one, and this is just an example of what the toxic element screen would look like, high mercury. And that would lead me therefore to be thinking about detoxification. And here's another example of what the nutrient elements will look like. And here we can see very high calcium, low magnesium, low sodium, low potassium, and an elevation of copper, an average level of zinc, and iron, a little bit elevated, but most things are quite low. So my instant thought, and I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail, is we've got the elevated calcium. So that calcium is not being properly utilised. We've got deficiencies of quite a few things. So that would lead me to question her digestive system. We've got an elevation of copper. So I might be thinking about whether or not there is an estrogen overload or perhaps a gut bacterial issue. So that's my overall glance. And then I would look at the report itself, which will give dietary advice, explanations, and supplement protocol. So the interpretive report that comes with the chart is very, very full. But very often as practitioners, we have questions, and that's where Mineral Check comes in, and we have technical advice here. You can always call in and ask. So when I'm using the test results in my practice, I will do the overall. I'm looking at the mineral levels. If I see, for example, with the one we just looked at, I saw a high copper level, I will know that I need antioxidants. I will be looking at the toxic profile and thinking about what I might need to do to detox someone. And that will give me a pattern about what kind of vitamins I need, whether I need to put adrenal support in, and so on. And I can get more detail from that by looking at the ratios. So some of you may use test results from another company, and those results may be in parts per million. We always present ours in milligram percent. Nothing technical about that. It just gives us a much smaller number to work with. So if I said that the calcium was 163 milligram percent, it's easier to work with than saying it's actually 1,630 parts per million. And I just put that there because you might want to use this later if you've got some results from another laboratory. So I'm going to go through now the ratios, which is this bit here. It will give you a little, so you get a little bit more understanding of how you can use the results. So a ratio is what the figure you get by taking one level and dividing it by another. So we might take the calcium level of 60 and a magnesium level of 5. We would divide 60 by 5, gives you 12, and that means our calcium ratio to magnesium ratio is 12:1. And that'll come in handy a little bit later on. You don't need to worry about the maths. I just want you to get what a significant ratio is. It is the level of one mineral compared with another. And the other thing that the test results will do is also will give us our metabolic type. And I put a couple of slides in for you on metabolic type, because we always say top right hand corner, the client is a fast 1, fast 3, whatever it is. And I put these slides in so that you can refer back to them if you want to later, if you're using the test. So you can just see what is happening with the adrenals and the thyroid. And I hope later on in the year to do a webinar based, now I've got into them, purely on the metabolic types. So I just think those slides are handy for you to have, because you can download the presentation if you want to, or I can send it on to you. So if we look at the calcium to magnesium ratio, that's our blood sugar ratio. And this will give us a clue about how a client is maintaining their level of blood sugar. As a practitioner, you'll know that from their symptoms and also from their diet. But technically, we can look at this because calcium promotes the release of insulin from the pancreas, and magnesium inhibits that release. So if we have a very elevated calcium to magnesium ratio, as in the sample that we had, then we're looking at a blood sugar issue, and we know that perhaps magnesium would be actually quite helpful. The other thing that I look at a lot, and I'm going to whiz through these ratios quite quickly because we've only got an hour, but we'll come back to them a little bit more if you have questions on them, is I look at sodium and potassium because I'm thinking about how someone's adrenals are functioning. If the sodium and potassium are low, then there's going to be a very good indication that they are in need of adrenal support and that they're short of digestive enzymes and hydrochloric acid. And with sodium and potassium being low, it's usually the hydrochloric acid that's the issue. And alongside thinking about someone's adrenals, I'd be looking at their thyroid. And we would expect this ratio to be about 4:1. Very, very commonly, we find this is actually much, much higher. And that'll give us a clue that somebody is hypothyroid. Now, they may not be showing us hypothyroid on a blood test, but they will be showing it subclinically. And the key here is that the potassium doesn't pick up the thyroid hormone. Potassium acts as a kind of lock and key mechanism for helping the thyroid hormone cross the cell wall. So if we have low potassium, the cells are going to have trouble picking up both the adrenal hormones and the thyroid. So it's a sort of a subclinical indication that something might be going on. And always look at it alongside selenium. If selenium is low as well, then the body will be having trouble releasing the thyroid hormone. The zinc-copper ratio will give us a little indication of what is going on with hormone status. I showed you that little slide earlier and said, okay, so this person has elevated copper. And what we're really looking at here is the potential for this to be quite estrogenic. So if copper and estrogen are detoxified in the liver in the same pathway, and when that pathway becomes overloaded, then what happens is it's like two rows of traffic going into one lane, and the estrogen and the copper are competing for excretion and tend to be reabsorbed because the lane becomes overloaded. With females, we also get a clue about their progesterone. A very elevated zinc level would tell us that potentially the progesterone is elevated too. In males, we can use zinc to look at their testosterone level and growth hormone. The research would back that one up quite clearly. I would also, if I have a very elevated copper level, start to think about not just estrogen, but whether or not there might be a pathogenic bacteria in the gut. So it might be an indication, if it doesn't come down at the retest, to consider doing more gut testing. And put another little slide here in, because this one really backs up what I was saying, in that really a low zinc and high copper is typical in females with PMS. And I've put some very specific indications there that you might want to refer back to later. Equally, if we have high copper and low zinc, we can tell that there might be an issue in the gut. Very typically with Candida, we'll have a very high copper level and a low zinc level. If the ratio is low, it might be a clue about the protein intake of a person. And a little bit more on copper. It is a very, very common pattern in a test. And what it means is that the copper is elevated copper means that copper is present, but it is not available for use. To be available, copper needs to be bound to a blood protein called ceruloplasmin. And the body makes that protein in the liver, and it gets a clue from the adrenals to make it by looking at, by the adrenals send the signal to the liver to make the copper binding transport protein. The liver then makes it, and it mops up the copper. This is critical because if we have low adrenal status, the body actually doesn't send enough of the signals to the liver to make the copper binding transport protein, and the copper continues to rise. It inhibits thyroid and therefore makes it harder for the adrenals to send that key pattern back to the liver. So we have this vicious circle where the adrenals and thyroid are lowered by high copper. The body needs good adrenals to make the copper binding transport protein, and it doesn't get the signal to do that. So that's a circle which is occurring. And what I want to do now is I want just, having whizzed through those ratios, whiz back to the results that we had at the beginning and see what more we can learn here. So what we're seeing here is an elevated calcium level. I was just trying to blow that one up on the screen, but that didn't really work for me. But we're seeing elevated calcium on the first page here, and that's going to give us some clues. Calcium only elevates for 4 reasons. It elevates because of a lack of protein in the diet or a protein metabolism issue. It elevates because of a lack of vitamin E, C, or B6. And it elevates because of a lack of magnesium or manganese. And finally, it elevates because of an issue with digestion and the thyroid. So we've got high calcium here with Susie. And you should be able to get that as full screen if you're watching the presentation. In presenter mode, it doesn't seem to let me. So what we've got is elevated calcium. We've got to have a look at why that might be occurring. We can see how sodium and potassium are very low. That's going to tell me about her adrenal function. It tells me that there is also the calcium to potassium. that there's a thyroid issue. So I can see there's an adrenal problem and a thyroid problem. And if there is an adrenal issue, i.e. low adrenal status, there is probably a protein digestion issue, because when the body is in the fight-flight mode and it has continually stressed adrenals, alongside that we see low HCl, hydrochloric acid. So I know there's a digestive issue. So looking at this one, I can see, first of all, that I need to support the adrenals. I can see there's a thyroid problem, so I need to support thyroid function. I can see that I need to be thinking about hydrochloric